Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today. I wanted to give everyone a little background. My name is Jonah Kowall. I'm the VP of Product Management at Aiven. We are a cloud platform for databases and data streaming. We provide the best open source technologies across many leading clouds, and we're the open source platform that you want to use to build your data streaming and data infrastructure. I wanted to introduce our special guest first. We're joined by Mike Zimberg. He is the CTO of Digital Asset Research. They are a specialized provider of clean digital asset data, insights, and research for institutional and clients. Prior to DAR or DAR, as Mike corrected me, Mike held a variety of leadership roles in capital markets and fintech, including as the global head of product development for Citicorp's prime brokerage, along with roles at Pine River, BNP Paribas, Bank of America, and Morgan Stanley. Quite a roster. Thanks for joining us, Mike. And before I move on to our questioning, Heikki, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, so welcome everyone, and thank you, Mike, for talking with us today. So my name is Heikki Nousiainen, and I'm a field CTO co-founder at Aiven. Looking forward to hearing your insights.
Awesome. So as we get started here, Mike, thank you again for joining us. Just echoing Heikki's comments there. Could you give us a little bit of an intro as to your role at DAR and just share a little bit more on that? Thanks.
Sure. So I've been at DAR 2 years now, just crossed the 2-year mark. And like any good startup, I am the CTO, and I'm also quite hands-on. So I am the database lead as well as being the CTO. So I do all the physical and logical modeling on the database, and I write all the ETLs. Few requests for ETLs since we're sitting here. So that's always fun. We have a complex 24/7 business at DAR, catering to institutional clients. So one of the things we do is stream a 1-second price onto the Bloomberg terminal, and we stream a 400 millisecond price to Chainlink. So that's 2.5 times a second. We're producing prices and then converting those into 4 other cryptos. It's in the order of 6 billion messages a month. We have other key clients like FTSE Russell, MG Stover, that we cater to. And there's a few interesting things about digital assets and getting this all to be correct. The data set is enormous, and there's no break. It's 24/7 markets, and there's no commonality. So we can have an asset called one thing at one exchange and something else at another exchange. So we're constantly having to make sure the mappings and the normalizations are correct. And in that, we have in the order of 75,000 pairs that we have mapped and track all the time. So one of the key architectural things that I was able to change was to get a layer in between every process that we run and the database. So if the database has an issue or we want to load more than one database, we're now able to do that. And that's where Apache Kafka comes in, and that's where we use your service. One of the other key things we do at DAR is we run every key process in duplicate, 2 independent versions of it. So we're collecting from Kraken as an exchange. We have 2 independent workers that collect. They both write to a topic in Kafka, and then we insert ignore into the database, so we don't have dupes. And that's worked out extremely well. Kafka has proven to be a good tool in this space, and Aiven in particular. One of the things when we were practicing for this that I thought about is I don't really look at it much because it doesn't really have issues, and that's been quite great.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And so just digging in a little bit deeper, you mentioned a little bit about your architecture, how you have multiple workers. I know that since we discussed you're running Kubernetes, could you tell us a little bit more about your cloud ambitions, sort of where you want to go, current state, and your future state?
Sure.
Um,
So
thanks.
we all read a lot about a microservice kind of architecture and serverless process. In reality, I debate this with myself that sometimes you can make things overly complex by trying to make them very small. And at this point, it is appropriate that we have many that run on EC2, and they're not serverless. We are bound to AWS, and AWS has also been great and helpful. We have many other processes that run in Lambda, so where that's appropriate. So think about something that has to run once a day, it takes 30 seconds to run. Lambda has been great for that. And you can use Kubernetes in Lambda as well. One of the things we are able to do is, in some cases, if we're running two of one thing, we're able to run them in different regions. So we've gotten some kind of resiliency across regions, but we still are quite tied into AWS, which I don't see us ever getting off AWS, but eventually we will become multi-cloud. And given that most of our things that are, so there's C# or Python, our custom homegrown software, we will eventually be deploying to other clouds as well, and which is one of the other things we really like about Aiven, the fact that you support other cloud providers, and we can keep running no matter what happens. So we don't ever have maintenance windows, and with our Kafka instance with you, we don't need them, and there's always rolling updates.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for that. Heikki, could you share a little bit maybe about what you're hearing from your other discussions with other companies around multi-cloud and this sort of trend that's happening?
Yes,
Thanks.
but maybe I'll start with the Kafka as a choice, and I think that's a common pattern that we see a lot. It's a great tool for working as a central pipeline, and perhaps decoupling those processors that you have. And a lot of our customers are using the similar model, and then perhaps pulling the data again from Kafka, doing processing, maybe projections into different type of database for queries. I think that quite similar in the way you are working. So a great tool at that, and one of the things that Aiven ourselves, we are big Kafka users underneath. And definitely that multi-cloud is something that is gathering interest, be it either for disaster recovery capabilities, or being able to just to perhaps access different type of services that are kind of available in one of the clouds. And also maybe then in later stages through mergers and acquisitions, we see that the companies might have presence in multiple cloud and want to use a common set of tooling and kind of things that make it easier for share access to data, reuse and repurpose existing data assets.
Yeah, makes sense. Mike, you mentioned that you're the jack of all database trades and all data flows. Could you tell us a little bit about some of your decisions on the database side? Because I found that pretty interesting, what you're doing, how you're using it, and how it gives you some efficiencies on the actual data side.
Sure. So we use
Thanks.
a database called Single Store. It used to be called MemSQL. It's an interesting tool in that we're able to use it for three different purposes. So we use it as a caching layer, we use it as a OLTP, and we use it as an OLAP. And it can handle all three of those well. Under the covers, other than the cache table, which you could force to be a row store, it's a column store, but you can interact with it like it's a row store. So it supports native MySQL. So when I got to DAR, we were using MySQL, which I wouldn't have guessed could handle the kind of volume that we were running through it at that time, which was in the order of 10 to 20 million trades a day. It was choking once every other or once every third day, I was waking up in the middle of the night with the team. And I have to give a credit to the team too. This is definitely not all me, and we have a great team at DAR. So we were looking to get out of MySQL as quickly as possible. We kind of outgrown it. And Single Store was able to meet the task quickly and have a massive amount of history. So it's bottomless, and it'll take the oldest records and move them off to S3. So our exchange trade table has 105 billion rows in it, and I can query it too. So as long as you design a good shard key, and having Kafka in between means that I can change the tables under the covers. I could have 2 of them or 3 of them, however many I want. I could load a different database if I wanted. I could load files, and that's been a key part of the architecture. We are quite hard bound into Single Store at this point. So that's something I'd look to improve in the future, where maybe we could have a layer on the way out. Because right now all my querying consumers are hard bound into the way we have things, and we can abstract it a bit through views, but we're still tied into the database. So, when we talk about or think about looking at some other product to augment what we have, because Single Store is a critical part of our architecture, and I don't see us moving away from it, but maybe something we could augment with other tools in the future.
Yeah, definitely a common pattern that we hear from customers. Heikki, can you tell us maybe a little bit about what you see there with using Kafka to diversify the data architecture? It's definitely a common pattern.
Absolutely, and one of the powers of piping messages through Kafka is that you can tap on it and make copies of the streams and try out different toolings as well. So we at Aiven, for example, we did that essentially when we needed to switch from InfluxDB to M3 for our own statistics and metric collections, just because of the volumes grew bigger than what InfluxDB could easily handle. But we ran 2 parallel streams until we were completely satisfied that we are getting the same results from both pipelines before then finally switching over. So Kafka as an architecture piece definitely made our life easier during that switchover.
Yeah, it lets you do a lot of interesting experimentation across the board. So it's good to know, Mike, that should some new business opportunity or idea come up, it can give you the flexibility. So it's always a good piece of the puzzle for sure.
Like it gives me quite confidence with giant data sets. So we're loading up all of Bitcoin transaction history, and we looked at it and we considered, as we've done in the past, just hitting our own node. We decided it'd be faster to get everything out, and the fact that there's only 900 million transactions is not scary to us anymore, which is pretty incredible.
Yep. What was once a big business problem becomes the norm. That's always what happens, like as you scale as a business. I mean, we've seen the same things where we see, oh, can we really deal with something that big? Now we do it regularly, but there's always that leap to like what's next and what you have to solve as a business. That's the fun stuff, right? So I did want to dig in a little bit more about the total cost of ownership, the TCO. I mean, how do you look at TCO in your data platform? You have a small team, you've got a huge amount of data, some pretty good complexity going in terms of diversity of data. How do you really look at the TCO of your data platform altogether and the team around it?
So critical for us to have a consistent controllable cost. And we did a detour on one of your competitors, and they did not have a predictable cost. So we had our instance, and then we had a variable ingress or egress charge, which made our total budget, some months were a problem, some weren't. So I very tightly control our costs to the, I spend roughly 30% of my time looking at everything that we do. So Single Store also does not have a variable cost. And just order of magnitude, we're something like 40% compute, 40% on the database, 10% on Kafka, and then everything else is more variable. So things like S3 files, network charges, and the fact that I'm able to control that 90% for the by and large has been incredibly helpful. So as we look at new areas of business, I'm able to quickly figure out how much it would cost to handle on the architecture side, and that's been really important to us. We do a lot of things internally that are, for our own cost purposes, which is appropriate, because no matter how much money we have to spend, we want to be fiscally responsible with the money we have. So one of our recent projects was we were using the API gateway through AWS. Looks like a good deal. It's only 90 cents per million. But you probably remember I was talking about our streaming 400 millisecond prices, sending 6 billion a month, got way too expensive. So shout out to our partners at Chainlink for bearing with us as we built our own homegrown WebSocket, and now finally have that fully implemented and are able to keep the costs much more under control.
Yeah, so you're always balancing what you should buy, what you should build, and the time to market. Obviously, if you use something that's a service, is much faster. However, building everything yourself also has costs associated. So I think you found a good middle ground where you can experiment and figure it out. I mean, one of the things that Aiven does is really provide that predictability. We don't have a lot of charges on top. We don't look at network charges. We kind of normalize a lot of that to make it easier for folks that have budgets to stay within them. So, Heikki, could you maybe provide a little bit of insights around that piece that you hear talking to our customers?
Yes, a lot of familiar topics. So, well, first of all, first item that always comes into mind is that how to keep the business running 24/7. So, kind of understanding also the importance of uptime and availability of those services. Then the second biggest, obviously, is that talent is always hard to find, and being able to utilize that talent where it really matters, of making sure that you can protect those investments that make the most business sense. Perhaps in your case, reflecting to that WebSocket access at the time, having ability to actually spend those resources in tackling that before moving into something else. Predictable cost comes up in all of our discussions. Ability to scale, to be able to use the right sizing of the service and right kind of controlling the cost that it matches with the workload, and then kind of being able then to ramp those up as the volumes grow. And overall, the ability to innovate, being able to move as fast from idea to execution and try out things, run a lot of experiments. Those are things that come up in our discussions.
And you reminded me of one other key part of cost, which is being able to have control. So being able to make all these trade-offs myself, and Aiven's been really excellent about that, because I can see how much of the resource we're using. I can see how every topic is behaving. I can see at some point we're going to need to upgrade. We're going to need more memory and compute, but I can predict all of that. I can see how much we're using, how many messages, how much throughput I need. And that is a challenge in some other services that you use. There's parts of it that are hard to control and manage, and that's been important too. So keeping the spend down, but giving us the control that we need to run it. And I think one of the reasons I'm a huge fan of Aiven is I can do everything myself. So I didn't talk to a salesperson, and no offense to you two, were brighter than me, but I didn't talk to anyone before we went onto your service. I knew it was something other single store customers were using, and I was able to go into your portal, spin something up, and it almost seems like a pipe dream. I don't know if people will believe this, but in 4 hours we were off our other vendor and completely onto Aiven. At that time, we had 30, give or take, topics. We have hundreds now, but the fact that we were able to do that in hours and completely turn off our old vendor is quite incredible.
Yeah, definitely. And it's good to see that you stuck to the open standards, because there's always that, you always think about, I could use the cloud provider's messaging system, but then obviously it doesn't, you couldn't do that on your own so easily if you had gone down a more proprietary path. So that's good on you that you stuck to the standards and gave yourself that opportunity to be able to be flexible without having to do a lot of rewriting and other complexity that involve in changing out infrastructure like that. So
no, we did
definitely.
look at briefly before we went with Kafka, and it's just, as you say, we didn't feel we'd get quite enough flexibility.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
we looked at running. I mean, we could run Kafka ourselves also if I wanted to hire some full-time engineers for probably 50 or 100 times what we pay for your service. We could do that, but it doesn't make a lot of sense.
We also don't preclude you from doing that, because everything that we do is open source. If you do ever decide to do that, everything, including our governance layer and everything that we use in our service, is open source upstream. So we don't have any secret sauce that locks you into Aiven, aside from providing a good service for good value. That's hopefully the lock-in that we provide, but it's not technical lock-in, right? So
it's true. We've gotten just absolutely incredible resiliency from your product. So my pipeline, for example, that ingests trades runs 1,000 times per second. So it's running on, I've got 96 partitions, and it runs about 10 times a second on each partition. And it'll grab whatever trades are there. And looking through the logs, I can see once in a while there's a DNS issue, which just happens in AWS from time to time. But I can see the next run, 1/10 of a second later, it works. So I don't do anything. I don't touch those pipelines, and that's quite amazing.
So since you're talking about the pipelines and how that works, we actually got a question about 10 minutes ago that was sort of relevant to that. So I wanted to ask you, when you run these two services that are basically they're essentially processing the same data. How do you normalize that so that you're not dual writing to the database? Maybe you could answer that for one of the audience members.
Sure. So each process normalizes. So it would independently normalize. So we'll know that XBT on Kraken is really Bitcoin for us. And so it normalizes and puts a message on the queue. And then we have a good key that we've defined on the table. And we do, if in some cases where we might get updates on data, we would replace. In the case of trades, we would get the same trade. So we do an insert ignore, and then we can track the time we actually got it. We also, I've been reading a lot more about Kafka. I know we could define a key, and you could stop the second one from even being written to the queue, but you might want to track that. So I think all of those models can easily be made to work, and at gigantic scale. So on big days in the crypto markets, we're looking at we could have 1 billion trades coming in duplicate, and we're able to keep up. By and large, we have every trade within a second is stored in the cache version. And if we're running really far behind, it might be 1 or 2 seconds.
So in theory, you could get a little more scale if you deduped in Kafka, which is something you could address if you want to, get every last bit of performance on the databases. You could deal with it in the queue layer and probably make it a little more efficient. But at this point, it's probably not a problem that you need to solve immediately. So
right.
Yeah,
that is something we'll look at. But it hasn't hampered performance because the database is it's able to use the shard keys really effectively.
Yep.
So we're able to, and we follow that pattern in very many high volume scenarios. Our pricing engines do the same. So the 2.5 prices a second is also running in duplicate, inserting, ignoring, and it's highly performant. But we are going to our keys. The other thing I want to look at keys for that can be interesting is you can set your contract between applications that way. So if you get garbage into your Kafka queue, Kafka's not going to stop you. It'll take the message that got published. But if you're expecting if you have a non-nullable column and you get a null, my pipeline will actually break and I'll have to go in and fix it. And we can prevent that by setting up a schema. So that's something else I want to look at. And I think in general, we think about, there's a new problem we're trying to solve. Should we look and see if we can do it in Kafka?
Yeah. Yeah, and we've done some really interesting work on the schema side. That's been a big investment for us, is really enabling that in the open source and not just in proprietary Kafka implementations. So yeah, it's good to hear. Usually it's a scale, like when you have enough teams trying to do stuff, but also in your case, it can help keep, the right kind of constraints around the usage. So yeah, makes sense. So on the TCO subject, because I know we were kind of going to move on, but there's a relevant question here. How do you balance high availability, cost, performance? Because these are all like trade-offs, right? You can spend more money on any one of those things. And so how do you balance in your head, like what's your thought process around what the right mix of those things are to give you the right resiliency that you need, the right cost level, and then the right performance that you need to deliver what the business requires?
So there's a lot of theoretical things we can talk about, but we're pragmatic and we have certain requirements we have to hit. And we have others that, I don't like getting up. As much as I love the team I work with here, we don't like talking to each other at 3 a.m, and we try and prevent that as much as we can. So I think keeping things running is critical. And if something goes wrong in general, we'll not just think about how do we solve that problem, but how do we have some pattern so that we can detect it and not have it ever happen again. But we're, like any good startup, constantly working on new things. So every time a new thing comes in, that's where we're kind of weighing all of those. Like how, what's our SLA requirement, uptime, how quickly do we have to respond to issues that come up, how fast does it have to run? And then generally we will cost all that out and see what it looks like before we start implementing. So it's really case by case. I think if we wanted to be up 100% of the time, rather than, we're probably 6 or 7 nines now, and just bound by AWS, which has had issues. We could duplicate everything pretty easily. The whole thing I described could also run somewhere else, and then we could get much closer to 100, or it could run in 3 places if we were willing to triple our budget. So those are all possible. And the fact that we see those and have a path toward that, I'd encourage others to just think about what kind of trade-offs and what kind of things you could put in place and start trying them.
Yeah, makes sense. So I did want to ask a little bit about future state. I mean, it sounds like you have a really good architecture and you've done a lot of really great things in terms of taking some of the best technology and bringing them together. But where do you want to take things? Like what's next on your agenda to tackle with the team?
Yes, so I think one of the things we're working on now is a consistent change process. So we've had a few different ways to do it, and we're looking at a common way to do it. And ultimately, we want to be using a CI/CD. And when we were prepping for this, we talked about Terraform, and that looks like it would be a great solution for us. But we always have to blend it with delivering new things, like any good startup. So I think getting really good at the change process, and I always think about like a good change, it should just flow like water, and you shouldn't know what happened, but the kind of automation that I know that you have, because we've done rolling updates, we would definitely like to build in. And I think I'd like to explore some more tooling that would help us abstract on the query side on the way into the database. So a tool like Trino, possibly, but without pounding the database and causing outages for using a tool like that, would be very interesting.
Yep, makes sense. And when you go down that Terraform journey, which over half of our customers use it regularly, it's definitely heavily used on our side in terms of customers using our Terraform provider and combining, providers from other components of their architectures to be able to do that automation, and also give you some of the cross-cloud capabilities, because Terraform is agnostic, which is one of the things that that makes it really useful. Heikki, do you have any comments on Terraform or kind of the advantages on that side? I'm sure you hear it a lot in your customer discussions.
In general, I absolutely love the kind of infrastructure as code, or kind of we almost want to push it to everything as code. So every even configuration and or user management, everything that is in the fleet goes through change management, and we can track on when something was changed. One really kind of interesting aspect is then the other side of the coin, that when you have everything in code, you can also audit that what is actually running matches what is supposed to and what has been kind of defined in code. So I think there's great benefits on utilizing tools like Terraform to manage your whole infrastructure. Definitely.
Thanks for that. So I did want to ask you, you mentioned a little bit around, how Aiven's cost effective and some of the reasons why you chose to use our service. But what kind of cost savings did you see when you moved from your other provider to Aiven? Just to understand.
We're doing significantly more than we were when we moved off our other provider, but even at that time, it was in the order of a 25% savings. We also had outages on our other provider. We had outages for hours where we couldn't connect to Kafka, and given the architecture, that is a complete failure scenario for us. Not that we were losing trades, but we were behind on every price feed at that time. We've never, I should knock wood somewhere, but we've been on your service about a year, and we haven't had an outage like that. We were inappropriately sized in the beginning. We were really trying to squeeze a lot of things into our instance size. So that was causing issues. But you could see that we were redlining on CPU and memory, and now that we've scaled up, we haven't had anything like that.
Makes sense. What did you do when you had that issue? Did you just need to get Kafka up and running, or did you have a workaround where you could kind of like go around the queue? I mean, was there a way to mitigate that, or not really?
Not really. No, there was no way around it. There's no plan B. So we used to also write to S3, but that got incredibly expensive. So I think S3 is a pretty amazing tool, and the fact that we're not a large firm, and when I started at DAR, we had 1 trillion files in S3. We didn't need most of them, so now we're down to only 500 billion files. Still significant, but if you can imagine every trade or every batch of 10 trades being written, it could get incredibly expensive. We do have a way most exchanges offer that we can go back and get history, but in this case, it was just trying to get Kafka up and running. But it is an interesting kind of failure scenario to think about. And I think, so let's say AWS was down altogether for a time. We would be down, and we would be catching up when it came back. But I think that's part of the trade-off we were talking about between resiliency and how much you're willing.
Definitely. So I guess some of the things that I also wanted to ask you about is if you could give some advice to some other companies looking to optimize or better build their data platform out. I mean, what would be Mike's short list of recommendations?
So there's so much theory and reading, and a lot of it is incredibly interesting, and there's lots of tools. What we found most useful is to actually try something. The best way to like the example of how we turned on your service. We just tried it. It was enough with the theory, and we just tried it. We did something similar with single store. So you can go into a complete analysis black hole, and you could spend a year looking at databases. But I think the best thing is to actually try something, and you'll see if it is it something you can see using. Is it easy to use? Can you figure out the things that aren't working well? That's been incredibly powerful for us. So we don't often have time to research every possible way that we could solve some problem, but we just try. Like literally just today, we're working out a way to do a FIFO queue, but as a cache table, which was actually the idea that you gave me. We'll have that going live today. I think we could have gotten it live in Kafka as well. A little more challenging to get all the pieces together that we need, but in general, we just try things. I think that's the best thing. Just try it. Just code it yourself. See if you can get it.
And you can always optimize it and iterate and get a better version the next time, right? If you need it, or you end up saying, oh, maybe we didn't need it, and you can throw it out and say we didn't waste huge amounts of time on trying to solve it, right? So
that's right. And one of the so Doug Schwanks, the founder CEO, teaches me a lot of things. One of the first things he said to me was, if we go and do a demo for a product the first time and we're not embarrassed, we did something wrong. We over-engineered it, and we don't know if it's right for the market yet. So that's exactly right. And it's, but I would say, even because you read my resume, and I have a lot of experience at very big places too, and still you can go down a rabbit hole of analysis for everything, and it's often useful to just try one of them. Maybe it doesn't work at all, and you can reject that one, but don't spend forever figuring out which one's best.
I'm just thinking of the most over-engineered problems I've seen in my career, and they're all in financial services. Like some of the architectures that I built at Thomson Reuters or were being built were pretty crazy, theoretical, what can you make a network do type of things that were interesting, but at the same time, a science project for products that didn't end up doing so well all the time. So,
and I found beautiful code is very simple and can be understood by anyone. And that's, every time I'm not doing that, I'm thinking this is too complex. There's probably a better way to do it. And I think that's key to look at too. And the fact that our architecture is now very simple, and I can pipeline off a Kafka queue, and in some cases I can do that in less than 10 minutes. I could have it running in production. I've got to spend some time, it's a new area, figuring out what database it goes in and doing a model and figuring out how it fits with everything else. But some of them can go as fast as 30 minutes just because it's straightforward to do that kind of coding.
Yeah. And it's because you have the consolidated data platform, it gives you a lot of advantages, and, without all the complexity that many companies I speak to just have such diverse data platforms that it becomes a lot more complicated. So, yep. Heikki, how about you? Any additional advice beyond kind of what Mike shared with us that you've either heard from customers or your experience in building Aiven that you could apply here?
I absolutely love the point about being able to try out things and run experiments and learn through that. I think that's that's a key to productivity and kind of very close to my heart from my background, and also something that we wanted to build Aiven for. Being able to really go from idea to execution, I think that's what's really crucial to be able to innovate. And that's leveraging services, leveraging technologies that really allow and enable you to do investments where it really matters. Kind of focus on what's business differentiating, what's additional business value, instead of kind of running your own team to do a task that you could have someone else perhaps cover for you. And then kind of that predictability on cost, and being able to understand the cost and being able to scale it, and yet kind of be able to make changes to the application based on the changing business requirements, and maybe even having that business continuity control over your own operating environment, so you can respond. You have always those options on being able to change as the business requirements change.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why open source is so critical, because the ecosystem that surrounds it, like even if it's not part of a project itself, primary project, someone has probably written some code somewhere on GitHub that gives you an idea of how they might have solved the problem, or even something that you could apply to solve the problem. So it's really powerful when you get these big ecosystems around a technology that you can leverage without having to build it all yourself or think of the concepts that you're trying to apply. So it makes sense. So I had a couple of additional questions. Appreciate all the insights, Mike and Heikki, that you provided to us today. Where did you start on your streaming journey, Mike? Did you just start with Kafka, or did you go somewhere else and then switch to Kafka? Was there, like, what was the thinking and the journey there?
So this was more of the try it out, and the folks here and I had the impression that Kafka would work best for us. So it was the first one we tried out. The folks at AWS are helpful, and we met with an engineer on Kinesis, and we're concerned about being too tied into AWS. And they encourage us to look at Kafka as well, and they have their own hosted version of Kafka. But that was the first one we tried, and it worked. So we haven't looked back since. In many prior lives ago, we used RabbitMQ for more like a FIFO queue, pretty different than a durable message queue. But this is the first time I'm actually using it, and won't be the last. Unless
I have fond memories of my RabbitMQ days too. So, sorry, what were you saying? I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's worked great for what we think it is. So, it's definitely not perfect, and it can't work for every use case, but for what it's intended to do as a durable message queue, it's been quite great.
Yeah, sounds good. And so, did you actually test Kinesis, or was it just more like in your short list of things to consider?
Just in the short list, and another limiting factor is at that point we were already on single store. So we wanted something that could work well to stream data in with a pipeline, and I don't know if they have any other way to stream it in other than Kafka, but we certainly didn't look at anything, and that's what the majority of the single store clients use. And the syntax is just super easy in single store. You just the Kafka, you give it the connection string, and off you go.
So are they multi-cloud as well? So as you kind of think about your strategy, you can stick with them as you diversify your clouds potentially, right?
Yeah, they're fully multi-cloud, and you can sign up for their database also without talking to anyone. But we, because we're in AWS, it made more sense at this point to have our own EC2s connect to the single store in AWS.
Yep, makes sense. So my last question to you, Mike, is this is more of a broad career sort of question. How did your career, your progression at these other organizations, large organizations, lead you towards your current role in being a technology leader at an innovative startup as DAR is? Like, what was that journey like? What did you learn along the way? What should people focus on as they're going through the same path that maybe you've taken?
Yeah, so I knew a long time ago that I wanted to be a CTO. That was something I always had a desire to be. And now that I've done it for 2 years, I actually still want to be a CTO. I quite enjoy it. I don't know if my path was the usual one that one would take or not, but I had a variety of different roles, from more business analysis to product management. And I started out coding on the mainframe, and you can see the gray in my hair to see that, back at Morgan Stanley. I think a few key things that I learned are, there's a few interesting leadership lessons, like don't ever ask anyone to do something that you wouldn't do yourself. So I always try to jump in and help wherever I can myself, and, not like push off any of the bad work. I always try to think about how things can get better, not just in the moment, but in the next thing. So I thought about that when I was a product person, and now I think about that every time a problem comes up on our infrastructure. Like, how can we solve this more generically and apply that pattern elsewhere? I think that constantly changing requirements and the whole ground shifting under you, that happened quite a bit, especially at the hedge fund that I worked for 4.5 years. And being able to handle that and be pragmatic about that makes you think about how you can design everything in an ultimately flexible way. So one of the ways that applied to us at DAR is, we had a lot of hard coding in our pricing engines, and we had to change code to price more assets or consume more assets from exchanges. But knowing that we had to be flexible, we made all that configuration driven. So now we have operations that can manage what's going on and what we're ingesting and how it's mapped and what we price. So those have been key things. Another thing I probably didn't do well when I was younger is just thinking the answer and being correct all the time and not listening to the input. So I think even when the input is from someone non-technical, they usually have something to say. There's usually some reason for that feedback, and typically you need to do something about it, and don't worry about being right. I think when I look back, even before I started this career, I studied philosophy in college, and I wrote a thesis on Socrates, who he didn't know anything. That was his main thing that he argued, but he argued that no one knew anything, and if they said they did, they were wrong about it, and you could prove them wrong. I think taking that approach to most of the problems has been helpful. One other thing I'd encourage, and I could probably go on these tangents for a while, but the people I've seen most successful and the people that I generally promote and hire and invest time into are curious. So you could take two approaches when either something goes wrong or you're throwing a curveball. You can start blaming, you can look for excuses, or you can be curious. Gee, why did that happen? I didn't think that could happen. Why did that happen? And I think, where I've had more success in prior roles is where I was curious and really drilled in and learned and like that.
Yeah, really learn the business, learn the things that are outside of your comfort zone. Yeah, definitely. That's really good advice, and you're not only a philosopher but a scholar, Mike. So I can guarantee you of that. Heikki, any kind of final comments or words? I'm sure a lot of that resonated with your journey as well. But anything that you'd care to add?
Yes, I'll just quickly add one. My favorite quote is that I didn't fail 1,000 times. I just found 1,000 interesting ways how things didn't work my way. And I think that's really important, that trying out things and being ready to maybe not succeed and learn from them, having that curiousness. I think that's a really key on kind of being able to do interesting things.
And it can be hard. These things we're talking about can be really hard. And I'm just thinking about back to some of the nightmares we had when we were on MySQL. And I remember an all-nighter when we had an outage of a few hours. This is going back almost to, maybe 20 months ago or so. And like struggling to be curious in this horrible outage that we couldn't control. But I just kept on asking, why is it not working this way? Why is this thing not operating this way? And it can be a challenge. You can want to throw up your hands and give up, but it's like you say, you just didn't find the right path yet. And you have to try to stick with that in all cases.
Cool. With that, I think we're coming up on time, but I wanted to thank you very much, Mike, for not only spending all the time with us today, but all the preparation that it takes, and sharing a lot of your advice, findings, and career path. I found that really interesting, and hopefully it'll be useful to some of the audience as well. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being a customer, and you should reach out when you have ideas or things that you want us to work on here at Aiven, because you're our most important focus area as the customer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Been great.
Thank you, Mike.
And
Heikki, thank you for joining us as well. Sorry, Mike. Continue. Yes.
No, it's been great. You're a strategic partner of ours, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate it. Have a nice rest of your day. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And we will be doing more of these live streams in the future. So stay tuned. Thank you to DAR, to DAR as well. All right. We'll talk to you all soon.
Bye.
Bye.